Hi, so I am Kristen Hope. I teach high school English and history at Tohoto Regional High School in Boylston, and this is my lesson plan 1 for HI940. So every year I show the film War Horse to my freshmen as part of the study of World War I. And after reading the Rosenstone text as well as the article on visual literacy, I thought that I could add a lesson before I show the film. So my students have kind of grown accustomed to thinking about why they're thinking and why they're studying history. We start the year with a really good article by Peter Starnes. And previous lessons, prior to this one, students will have read about and discussed the causes of World War I. And they would have a basic knowledge of the technology and weaponry available because of their study of the Industrial Revolution. Some of the things from the Rosenstone text, particularly chapter 1 and 3, which inspired, I suppose, this lesson, were the way that he talked about the purpose of history. So it's not to learn about the past, it's to relate to the past. I've highlighted some of the key quotes from chapters 1 and 3. And you can see that they all have some sense of expression or emotion or relationship, making the past meaningful, personalizing the past for us. And that's kind of why I've been showing War Horse in our study of World War I, because a lot of people don't know a whole lot about World War I. A lot of people can't relate to it. And War Horse just has this amazing way of reaching younger audiences. And this is a unit that I do with freshmen. And reading Rosenstone kind of reinforced for me that yes, this is, an okay thing to include a full-length feature film. There we go. So here's my lesson. It's an introduction to trench warfare. It comes right before I start showing the film. When I show the film in class, by the way, I have it broken down into about 25-minute segments. We watch it over the course of 5 days. We have a series of discussion questions after we watch each section of the film. So I've got my objectives up there. I've got my standards. The materials that you would need for this lesson are the PowerPoint, which is included in this PowerPoint. You would need printed copies of the textbook selection. We have a primary source from a soldier at the time. We have a photograph from 1916. We've got 2 Chromebooks with YouTube videos queued up from both War Horse and Wonder Woman. So the idea is that students are going to be able to look at these various sources, consider the various forms of history, their purposes, their possibilities, their limitations, and start to have an idea of trench warfare. So here is my lesson plan, which is also attached as a doc, and I will just talk through it as we go. So this is what students will see when they enter the classroom. It's just a simple Venn diagram, the difference between textbook history and movie history. And this will just kind of start by getting students thinking about the different forms of history. It'll give the teacher an idea of what the students know about both forms. And hopefully the class will be independent enough, or at least have an independent leader to fill us out on their own. However, if the teacher needs to step in, some features that might appear on the Venn diagram are, on the textbook side, it's words and pictures. On the movie side, it's moving pictures, dialogue, characters. It'd be interesting to see where on the diagram students would put facts, where they would put stories, where they would put truth. And I'm assuming that most kids would write boring on the left-hand side and exciting on the right, but we shall see. Then we move into a more kind of teacher-directed analysis of the 2 genres. Looking at audience, author, and purpose. We've talked both in English and history about the rhetorical triangle at this point, so students should be able to start filling this in. The teacher would be doing this up on the board, students would be copying into their notes. And what I would be trying to get at is that the purpose is influenced by the author and the audience. Something that Rosenstone mentioned was the limitations and possibilities of both textbook history and movie history. He uses the term film. I would just use the term movie because my students are more familiar with that and can relate to it more. After we finished filling out this chart, I would just have the students in their notebooks on their own answer these 4 questions and emphasize the fact that, their ideas are going to be different from their classmates, but they're just as valid. So what is history? What is the purpose of history? What other forms can history take? And then which form is the best? In terms of the forms, I'm trying to get them to think about, not just primary and secondary sources, but photographs, museums, work of art, epic poetry, that kind of thing, novels. And they may or may not be able to come up with those on their own. And then in terms of which form is the best, I'm really trying to get them to think, well, which one is the truest, or which one is the most effective? Which one can I relate to the most? And that will help to answer their questions about the purpose of history. So it's really kind of a philosophical introduction here, and getting them to think about, both forms of history, both textbook and movie. All right, so then we get into trench warfare. So they've already studied the beginning of the war. They know that we're going to be watching War Horse. They know that trench warfare is the main focus. And here we go. These are the questions that I would display on the board. I'd say, all right, these are questions that history students, you guys, should be able to answer about trench warfare in World War I. And the questions range from kind of just basic description, what were the physical conditions like, how did the men feel, describe no man's land, and then going into those kind of higher level thinking skills. So making predictions, what effect did trench warfare have on the soldiers? Predict and analyze, how might have it affected the course and outcome of the war, and evaluate. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have the class split into groups. They're each going to get a primary or secondary source, and they will have 10 minutes with this source. And they need to determine, all right, if these are the questions that I need to be able to answer, how many of them can I answer with just this one source? And how correct would my answers be? Now, I'm deliberately not going to explain what I mean by correct, and that's why I have it in quotes as well. Just trying to get them to think about, what are the various uses of historical sources? Where does true history lie? That kind of thing. So I'd hand out their sources, and they would have 10 minutes. They would be able to talk about their, which of these questions can they answer? How correct would it be? Etc. And after that 10 minutes, they would have a chance to send one person up and just kind of explain, how many of their questions could they answer, and are they advocating for or against their source. So I'd put each source up on the board so that students could see what they had. The first one is from the textbook. It's fairly dry, but there are some quotes and primary sources embedded in there. The next one is a primary source from Walter Hare, talking about his experience in the trenches. Then there's a photograph, and I'm guessing that this group would struggle the most because they're not very practiced in visual literacy at this point. They wouldn't, know how to really dig in and analyze just a single still photograph, but that's okay. Then we have a clip from Warhorse. This is linked to YouTube. This is when the soldiers are kind of going out onto the front lines. And then we have a clip from Wonder Woman, and this is probably going to throw most of them for a loop. I think that a lot of them have seen the movie, but they were not aware that this was actually set in a real historical time period. Even though we have, you know, this superhero and this crazy villain and this poisonous gas, you know, these are all things that are inspired by not just the original DC comics, but also World War I, which were also inspired, inspired the DC comics. After each group has a chance to come up and just say a few words about their source and what they got out of it, I would be displaying this slide. So could you answer all of the questions with just your source? No, you couldn't. Why not? Because it's not enough to just have one single source. You know, this is why we mix sources when we're teaching history. This is why we use primary and secondary. This is why we include photographs. This is why we include diary entries. This is why we are including Warhorse. And then just kind of asking the kids, so what's the ideal combination of sources for answering these questions? And here they all are listed. And again, they'll all have different answers. This is just going to be an informal discussion. Finally, in the last few minutes of class, I'm going to have the kids go back to their questions that they answered in their notebooks and ask them, how have your answers changed after exploring various sources that focused on trench warfare? And they can just go ahead and add to their notes. And hopefully, you know, this lesson will get them thinking about why we are watching Warhorse, you know, what they can get out of it that perhaps they couldn't get in a textbook. Start to get them thinking about, you know, the relationship between history and fiction and film and book and printed text and everything. And in terms of the assessment, the way that I would assess, you know, have the students considered these various forms of history, their purposes, their possibilities, their limitations, is just by looking through their notes and listening in on their discussions. So that is my lesson. Again, if I go back here, they won't let me go back, that's okay. But you know, if I go back to the objectives, the standards, I believe that this lesson meets this. If I were to go back to the quotes from Rosenstone, I believe that this lesson does kind of show students that there are different ways of relating to the past, and you know, using a full combination of all of these forms and genres is the way that they are going to be relate to the past in the most effective way. So there we go. That's my lesson.